There was a time when the pulpit stood at the centre of public life. Before podcasts, before television, before the internet placed 1,000 interpretations of scripture within reach of a fingertip, there was the preacher. And behind many of those preachers sat books. Very large books. Beginning in the late 19th century, more than 100 ministers and scholars contributed to an extraordinary undertaking, a commentary spanning the Bible, created not simply to explain Scripture, but to help men preach it. They called it the Pulpit Commentary. Its pages contain theology, history, exposition, sermon outlines, moral instruction, and something its authors could never have intentionally recorded: the world in which they lived. Victorian Britain, an expanding empire, industrialization, Darwin, new archaeological discoveries, changing ideas about science, society, class, women, culture, and the ancient world, all surrounding the interpretation of an ancient text. And that raises a rather interesting question. When we read Scripture, how much of what we see comes from the text? And how much comes from the world standing around us while we're reading it? Welcome to the Pulpit Commentaries, a documentarian's journey through Scripture, history and interpretation. Each episode begins with a passage from the Bible. We discover what the writers of the Pulpit Commentary believed it meant and what they believed a preacher should say about it. Then we step outside the book. We entered their world. What was happening when those words were written? What did they know about the ancient world? What had yet to be discovered? What assumptions would have seemed entirely ordinary? And how might those things have entered the pulpit? Then we cross the distance between their world and ours. More than a century of archaeology, biblical scholarship, historical discoveries, cultural change, and generations of Christians asking many of the same questions. Sometimes we'll discover interpretations firmly belonging to another age. Sometimes modern scholarship will reveal something the Victorian commentators simply could not have known. And occasionally, we may discover that those old voices notice something we've forgotten. Because the Pulpit Commentaries isn't about proving that they were wrong or that we are right. It's about something much more interesting. It's about discovering how human beings, separated by centuries, stand before the same ancient words and try to understand what they mean. Created for listeners fascinated by Scripture, but also by history, culture, theology, and the evolution of ideas, the Pulpit Commentaries invites believers, curious Christians, pastors, students, and anyone intrigued by the Bible's extraordinary journey through human history to open these old volumes again, not as relics, not as authorities beyond question, but as witnesses to another generation wrestling with the same texts we still wrestle with today. 23 volumes, more than 100 Victorian voices, one ancient text. An archaeological exploration into what they wrote, the world that shaped them, and what more than a century of distance allows us to see between the lines.